just to tell you a little bit about our company, we've been working with Alpha software for better than a decade, and we've been a big fan of the ease and the ability to do a lot of work, or let's say a little bit of effort, and to produce a lot of work. Recently, we decided to expand our practice to start working with SalesForce because, as David mentioned, that it's become, I don't think I even have to tell you that it's become a very popular enterprise application. And one of the things we found when we started working with it is that it is a very good system for putting together a simple interface, and you can do that quite well, and that is great. But what we did find out is if we wanted to have a more extensive UI interface, or we wanted to do more programmability, we were running into some issues. We've built a demo that we have on this presentation that is an application built in Salesforce, and we've extended it. It's a application to manage volunteers. So what I charged our developers with is, let's do a proof of concept, and let's just see how we can use Alpha Anywhere, that is a great development tool for doing very productive work. And let's see if we can connect Alpha up to Salesforce. Let's see if we can build an application in Alpha and use that application to communicate with Salesforce and to get data from Salesforce and to send data out to Salesforce. All this time using the Alpha UI, which allows us to do a much more complicated presentation behind the scenes than Salesforce would give us. So I handed the challenge out to our developers, and our developer, David Perry, who's on the call with us, was able to get to work on it. It was a great challenge, and there were many issues that we had to overcome, not necessarily in the Alpha world, but just in the overall authentication between the two products. And David did a great job working with the people at Alpha who helped us out with a few issues here and there that we had to do. And so I'm excited to share some of what we found. By the end of today's presentation, you should have an idea of how the approaches that we made to do this, and what you can do with Alpha and Salesforce to Alpha. So I'd like to hand this over to Dave Perry, who is one of our developers, and he can take it from here.
Hi, this is David Perry. I'm going to show my screen here so we can look at some stuff. Can everybody hear me? Dave, can you hear me okay? Okay. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at SalesForce, our application in Salesforce. So let me get over here. Let's see. Okay, we have an application here that has a volunteers table, and we have some test data in here. Now what I'm going to show you is that this data exists in Salesforce, and then now what I'm going to do is come over to our application that demonstrates us retrieving that information. And we're going to go through the code later, but first I'm just going to demo the application itself. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my test page here. Okay, so this basically, this Alpha application is running on my server. It uses the REST API that Salesforce provides, or provides for developers to access the data. It retrieves the data and just shows these records here in a table. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come over here. I'm going to edit one of these records. Let's see. Actually, what we'll do, let's just add a record. Let's go with New York, easier. Okay, I'm just going to fill in those few fields that we will show in the form. So I'm adding this as a new record in SalesForce. Okay. Now let's see, we have 4 records. Come over here, hit refresh. Now we see our records. So that's basically using the REST API to communicate with SalesForce to retrieve those records. Now, I also have another page which I'll bring up. Aside from retrieving records from SalesForce, we can also update records. Let me pull up this page. And I've just hard-coded the values. This is basically, we'll look at the code later, as I said, but basically this is the ID of the record that I want to update. And let me just go back over here. You can see that ID is, this is the SalesForce ID of this record. And then for the field, you have to provide the field name that SalesForce understands on their side. They give, you know, when you create an application in SalesForce and add tables, they will they'll have an internal ID for the field name. So that's what that is, and this is the value that I want to change it to. So I'm just going to actually make this something different. So I'm going to submit that, see that it's working. Then we go back over to SalesForce. Let's find you. If I go into my record, which was 22192 or something, I think it was 22407 before, now it's 22193. So you have the ability of updating records, deleting records, and also selecting records. Now, one of the other things that I want to talk about is, you know, this, like I said, this is running on my server, an alpha application, and another feature that SalesForce provides is what's called a canvas, Force Canvas, and I'm going to demo that right now. Essentially, what that is, is it allows you to actually integrate any application written in any language, as long as it's web-based, basically into the SalesForce. Now here I have it set up to integrate into the chatter area, and basically when I click on that, it runs your application in an iframe inside of SalesForce. So I actually already had set this up. I was having trouble with this working in Internet Explorer because of a certificate issue, but I have it running in Safari here. But what I'll do, since we added a record, I'm going to go ahead and just hit this again, and now you can see that the extra record is in there, and also that the zip code has changed. Now this application is actually running on a Azure server, and it's being called, like I said, within SalesForce using an iframe, and there's some authorization and authentication that goes on, which we'll look at now or in a few minutes, that basically goes on to make this all work properly and make sure that this is actually a request coming from SalesForce. Okay, so let me go ahead and go over to the code. Let me find that. Okay. So let's look at the select functionality first. So basically what I did is, let me edit this page. I created a class that actually makes these calls for me, and we'll look at the class in a minute, but essentially I'll just go over what's involved as far as the authentication and the security. So in order to interact with Salesforce via the REST API, you have to be authenticated, and the way that you do that is with what's called an OAuth token. So we essentially make a request. The first request is actually a login. That login, and in this case, I'm passing the credentials in with the call. Behind the scenes, you can also have it set up so Salesforce prompts for the user to enter their credentials, but in this case, I'm passing them in. And when you do that, you actually have to have a security token included with your password. And once you go and set this up, there'll be some discussion about the security token. But if you change your password, your security token gets reset. So if you decide to pursue this, that's something to keep in mind, is that those two are tied together. The other part of this is when you set up a connected app in Salesforce, you get what's called a client ID, and you get a client secret. These two things are required in order to be able to connect through the API to your data. And here, there's actually two ways to get select data out of Salesforce. They have their own, I want to say, watered down or basically a select language or SQL language that's specifically for Salesforce. It's not as robust as normal SQL would be, but it does allow you to construct queries similar as you would in other database languages or database systems using SQL. In this case, I'm selecting the records out of the volunteers table, and you can again see that they do require you to know the names of the fields as they store them internally. There is a way to retrieve that information, which I'll touch briefly on later. But essentially, I'm selecting, these fields, and let's scroll here. You can see that this selecting those fields, and you actually have to specify the fields that you want. You can't do a star in their language and you can see it's from this table. So that's one way of selecting the data. There's another way, if you're familiar with REST API calls or RESTful services, you can also do a GET using the standard GET method. We're not doing that here just because I wanted to see how this select stuff worked for this situation. So essentially what I do, so this is really just a setup, and at this point here I create the instance of the client, the Salesforce client I created, passing in the username, password, security token, client ID, and client secret. And here's my query. I'm passing that into a GET call on the class, and that's where the client actually does all the work here. So let's go over to the class. Okay, so this is a class written in Alpha XBasic. You can see here, here's my constructor where I'm passing in these values. Essentially, I'm initializing, I won't go into real deep here, but essentially I'm initializing a request to the logins URL for the OAuth token. That's posted. I retrieve the data back, and one of the values that is or returned is the OAuth token. I persist that in the class at the class level, so any future requests that I make will use this token, and that way I stay logged in essentially. Okay, so then for the GET, it's in this case, as I said, I'm using their SQL language, so it's really a query URL that you pass that into, and I return back the, fetch the results, and it's returned in JSON. So I just parse that, and then in the web page, I loop through the results and show that on the web page. So really, that's really basically about it. The hardest part of this was, like John had mentioned, was getting this authentication to work. And since we're here, what I'll talk about, I'll just briefly talk about how the client or the Canvas app works. It's a little different for the Canvas app because, as I mentioned, it runs in an iframe, and what it does is once you try to retrieve that page or view that page, it actually makes a post to the page on your server, and in that post is going to be what's called a signed request. And what you have to do, you can see down here, is essentially you have to parse that value that they give you, and you have to compare the values that are in the signed request to what the Canvas secret is, and basically if they match, then it's a valid request, and you can go ahead and show the data. In this case, if it doesn't turn out that they match, then I generate an error here. But so that's really the difference, and there's actually two ways you can do the Canvas app. The signed request is what they recommend in production, so I went with that. The other way is to actually make a GET request for the OAuth token, but the signed request is probably the way you want to do that. So really, that's really about it as far as the security or accessing the data. Some of the other things that you need to be concerned with is you can actually, as I mentioned, you have to know your internal names for your data or your fields and your tables. You can actually request that from Salesforce using basically the SObjects link or URL, and that returns back the information for all your tables, and you can actually use that to, if you wanted to, for instance, build something that was more dynamic, you could retrieve the fields out of that data and show that, or allow the users to be more interactive with the data. But as John had mentioned, this was more of a proof of concept, so this is pretty much what we did with it. The other part that we demonstrated was an update. Let me find that here. So here's the update. Now, the way the update works, it is using the REST API approach, and it's using the patch method for the HTTP method patch. And basically, again, it's pretty much just passing in a URL. Let's go look at that. Let me find. If we look at that code. Same setup where I'm instantiating the Salesforce client with the security information. Internally, that class logs in, gets the OAuth token, and then my next call is to the update method, and I pass in the URL. This is the table that I want to update, and then it passes in the ID of the record I want to update, the field and the value, and then that gets executed into, or in here with an HTTP fetch, or actually with the patch method, and that's really how it works. That's all there is to that. And I think if there's anything else, John, am I missing anything? Any descriptions or John?
I think John is on mute. So John, take yourself off mute if you want to answer. Oh,
yes,
there we go.
okay, that helps.
Yeah.
No, I don't think that you're missing anything. It appears to be like a lot of code, but it's like a one-time deal. You can basically set it up and forget it.
Yeah, this is, like I said, this is a class. Really, the functionality is once the class is set up, the functionality really is that. That's it. You set up your security. Here's the call to instantiate the class, and then you call get, or you call one of the methods on the classes, either get or an update or whatever, to be able to retrieve data or update data in SalesForce.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. It did actually run pretty much exactly 25 minutes, like we said. There are not a lot of questions, but if people would like to ask questions, go ahead and type them into the questions box. We do have at least one. This one comes from Albert, and his question says, in your source code, let me take a look. Just reread that. Oh, the credential details for Salesforce that you've put in the code, is it sort of risky having them there like they are, or is that code hidden away, protected, or something like that?
Well, this was a proof of concept more than anything else. There probably would be better ways to do that. Assuming that nobody can, directly access your A5W pages, you're probably okay. But I would recommend doing some other, or maybe doing maybe a more secure approach. Maybe you could put them in a file or something, or retrieve them dynamically or something like that. But yeah, that's a valid point.
I think that's pretty much it for questions. So it will be a short session today.
The one thing that...
Go ahead, John.
One thing, David, that you probably didn't show, and I don't know if it's of interest, but just the interface from the Salesforce side. Setting up the Canvas app and the...
Yeah, we can talk about that. So basically, what you'll do on the developer side here is you will want to create what's called a connected app, and you would go into setup and create. I won't create one here, but unless we can look at the ones that I do have set up here. So if I do, hold on. If I go to apps, this is where you would go down to the bottom here, and that's where you would create or click new. But here's the A5 Canvas test app, and essentially what's required to set that up is basically you specify the app URL. You say whether you're using the OAuth or the signed request method. As I mentioned, the signed request is probably the way to go. If you use the OAuth method, you do need a callback URL. If you go that way, you can research that, but it's required either way. So you can either point it to a fictitious page, point it to your app URL, or just point it to something. But there has to be a URL in there. I still haven't figured out why they do that, but anyway, so that's really all. Once you have that set up, as I mentioned, this is running on a cloud, a Azure machine, and it pulls it right into Salesforce and looks as if it's part of Salesforce. So it is pretty neat, neat functionality there.
Cool.
And then the only other thing is you do have to do some things to set up access for or via the REST API. That's probably something that you guys will probably need to research. The Salesforce documentation seems to be a lot. There's a lot of it, so I do actually have a few links that we'll include in the recording, I think, but it's hard to find sometimes as far as what you're looking for. But generally, the two big things are you're going to create a connected app, and also you have to set up access to via the REST API. Other than that, you should be able to get pretty far with it.
So it's funny that you brought that up, because someone did actually ask how the documentation was, whether it was adequate for the API, and you said there's a lot of it, but it's probably hard to find. Yeah,
there's a lot of documentation. They do have. I did a search last night. There are some people that have written articles or posts about how to set this up that definitely I wish I had when I first started working on this. So there seems to be more and more information out there. Just probably Google is your friend in this case for whatever you may be doing in particular. I saw an article last night that was somebody had written a .NET app and had it up in Salesforce in a Force Canvas app. So people are starting to look at this and starting to implement it. So more and more information is out there.
That's great. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, David and John, for your presentation today, and thanks for everyone who attended. In a few days, a recording of today's session will be posted at alphasoftware.com/events. And as David had mentioned, we will be including a little bit of information at the end of that recording, including a way to get in touch with FirmSupport, although I'll talk about that in a second. And also some links to documentation and other things. A few people have asked, and they always ask, will the code be available? No, this is their intellectual property. They spent a lot of time developing it. I'm sure they'd be able to help you out if you're interested, though, in consulting services to help you get Alpha Anywhere working with Salesforce.com. So if you're interested in contacting them for that reason, you can go to FirmSupport.com, or you can email John directly at john.bowen, BOWEN, at FirmSupport.com. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope to see you at a future webinar. Take care. Bye-bye.